born in the midst of World War II in England. My dad was a doctor in the British Army, and after the war ended, Dad was sent to Palestine to go organize a field hospital there. And Mum and I went back to Jamaica on the banana boat, would you believe? Dad rejoined us in Jamaica probably about a couple of years later. He's finished his tour in Palestine and was sent to Jamaica. Shortly after that, I was sent to my first school. It was a military school in Upper Camp, the Defense Force compound. And it seemed that I was a bit of a handful back then. Some might say still now, but never mind. And the military school wasn't able to manage me. So I was taken out of that school, and my dad sent me to a Church of England school called De Carteret Prep, and that was about 60 miles west of Kingston in the mountains of Mandeville. That was an interesting school. Every day started with chapel and finished with chapel, except Sundays when it was a full morning service and evening song. Well, okay, so the first morning I'm there, we're in the chapel and we've got our hymns, ancient and modern. Some of you will remember that book. And we're singing away, and all of a sudden I feel this whack, whack, whack on my shoulder, I think. And I look around, and there's Mrs. Morton York, the Reverend Morton York, who's the headmaster's wife, with a cane, one of his whipping canes, and she's on the shoulders. And I thought, crikey, I haven't done anything yet. What's all this about? And she says, come here. I meekly go off, and she says, you're going to sit in that front row, the ones that are facing each other. Take that first seat there. Go up there now. And that process continued for a while, and then I realized this was choir selection back then. Well, I didn't know I could sing, so there you go. But anyway, one of the great things as a youngster of that age, we thought it was the greatest thing ever to be in the choir, because you were the last people to get into the chapel and the first people out. So much for dedication, but that was a schoolboy. After De Carteret, I went to a secondary school in Kingston as a day boy. They still had chapel there, but no morning and evening services on Sunday and this sort of thing. Reaching teenage years, my mom decided it was time I should probably get confirmed. And that, of course, is when an adolescent or adult makes a reaffirmation of the promises that parents and godparents made for me when I was an infant. And that was something else again. It was an unusual experience, because what we had to do was learn the catechism by heart, as well as the order of service for confirmation and the communion services by heart. And I think it was the only thing that kept me going was an attraction to a nice young blonde gal. And I thought, well, I mean, it was all one way, but, you know, it kept me coming. Anyway, I got confirmed and so on, and I used to go to church on Christmas Day and Easter, and once or twice throughout the year when I sort of thought my stocks were running low, and I better put in an appearance so that God might know who I was and I was still around, sort of thing. I had no concept of God's presence in those days. And I mean, when we when we said the prayers in communion and so on, I mean, at one point I used to think, gee, I feel a bit proud that I could just rattle off the prayers. But they were just words. They had no meaning. They were just words trotted out because I had remembered them. Anyway, got married in Jamaica. We had our first 2 kids there, and then we migrated to Australia in 1974. In 76, we moved into our first home that we built in Wheelers Ridge. And Adrian found St. Matthew's Anglican Church, which was a short distance away from where we lived. And so we fronted up there and started worshiping there. A fellow called Dick Caney, who was perhaps one of the most memorable for many of us parish priests. It was his first day there when we rocked up, and we had many good years with him. But he was an unusual leader. He empowered people, and he was the first parish priest that I ever thought was human. All the ones back in the past had been sort of up there on a pedestal. And here was this guy who was absolutely, totally human. And it was refreshing. At some point, I think it was probably it was in June of 1977, we learned that the first expression of the Anglican marriage encounter weekends were going to be held. And we found out a bit about it. It was basically taking what you had and polishing it up better as a marriage, you know. So we thought, okay, we'll give that a go. And that was a timeless, childless weekend. You went off to a motel. It was the Brighton Savoy that we went to. And the team that led us were 3 lay couples and a clergy couple. At each of the presentations, there'd be the clergy couple always present, and the lay couples rotated through with different presentations. And what would happen is that the team would share their stories, life stories, deep and personal, about things in their life that focused on the topic of that particular segment. The first one, for example, was the focus on feelings. And that was a bit of a culture shock for me, and I guess many other men, because traditionally men aren't taught to show their feelings or express them in any way. And this was a very new experience. But then what happens is, as the teen couple present and lead us with their sharings, a lot of which was quite deep and meaningful, that encourages us to think along those lines. Then at the end of that session, we were given a question that we had to dialogue on. And the process of dialogue was that your husband and wife separated. One went to the bedroom, the other stayed in the conference room, and you wrote on the question, like, how did this make me feel, or things like that. And you wrote for 10 minutes. And at the end of 10 minutes, the person in the conference room went up to the bedroom, and we then swapped books and read each other what each other had written, and then we dialogued and spoke about what was going on and what we shared and so on for 10 minutes. And that was the end of that section. The weekend built, and I can remember on the Saturday night, it starts on a Friday night and ends on a Sunday afternoon. So by the time we get to the Saturday evening, and the last presentation there actually was themed on the miracles of Cana, where Jesus turned water into wine. And I guess there was a hint for us to become the new wine as well, although it was very low-key, the way things came across about God and so on at that point in time. And I can remember after we did our 10-10 dialogue, as it was known, back in the room, I was talking with Adrian, and I was sharing some struggles I had with, with God and talking to God and how did this all work and questions like that. Earlier in the evening, a couple of lady couples had said if anyone had any questions throughout the day, feel free to come along and the team of the Les and Cynthia Bond, who at that time were in Brighton, I think. And we said, look, this is the problem, the issue, and we spent probably, I don't know, maybe close to an hour with them. In later years, I was to learn what a sacrifice that was for them. But I came out of that session with Les and Cynthia with the realization that just as I had grown so much closer to Adrian by sharing with her on a much deeper personal level feelings and thoughts, if I was going to have any kind of relationship at all with God, then I was going to have to sort of adopt the same techniques and start talking to God in a more meaningful way, more frequently than I had been doing. Basically praying, but not the pious sort of prayers that you often associate with people praying, but just basically having a heart-to-heart with God about what's on your mind, what's troubling you, those sorts of things. It was, then the next morning, the Sunday morning, I think it ramped up a bit. The couples presented as usual, and at the end of that they gave us the question and they said, well, today it's a very special day sort of thing, and this time we're going to give you some more time. Instead of the 10-10, we're going to give you 90 minutes to write and 90 minutes to dialogue. And people went, I just managed 10, now you want 90? What's going on? The question was something along the lines of, how would I feel if this was my last day on earth? Something along those lines. And I have never cried so much in my life. It was at the risk of upon a watershed moment in a sense. But got into it, and there was no problem, and I wrote and wrote and wrote, and when it got to the end of the 90 minutes, I was surprised. We shared on that in the room together, and the weekend concluded, and I shared some of that. At the end of it, the last thing that happens on a Marriage Encounter weekend was that there'd be a communion service in the round, and there was an invitation for folks to share anything that, of note. So I shared what had happened to me and so on, and then we sort of packed up and went home and so on. A couple of 3 days later, we get a call from one of the team and saying, look, we'd like to invite you and Adrian back for a deeper weekend in two weekends' time, because there's more and so on. And I said, well, we don't have the money to do that. And they said, no, there is no money involved. We just want you to come back. And so we did this deeper weekend. And that was preparation to going on team of Marriage Encounter. We did the weekend, and then we started writing talks, but we had to say to them, look, Adrian at that point in time was modestly pregnant with Stephanie in 1977, and we said, well, we've got to get this baby out sort of thing and settled before we can start going away and doing things like presenting weekends and that sort of stuff. But we eventually did get on to team and presenting talks and so on, and then you get the next set of talks and so on. And finally, we were leading Marriage Encounter weekends many times in Sydney, in Brisbane, even back-to-back weekends in Perth. It was interesting, when we went to Perth, we took the three girls then with us, and we knew we were going to be billeted and the kids would be looked after, but our friends couldn't understand. We didn't know where we were going to stay or who was going to look after our kids, and they thought, you must be nuts, you know, to just give your three kids over to somebody you've never seen before for a weekend. But God does provide, and anyway, so after a while, they decided to change the outline of the talks and presentations, and by then we were a bit long in the tooth as presenters, as it were, and we perhaps had lost our freshness that new couples off of a weekend have, that fire. We were still smouldering, but not on fire, if you like it, if you know what I mean. So we took the decision to back out of Marriage Encounter because we really didn't have the time or the will to recommit to writing fresh talks. I think in all there was something like about 9 or 10 talks you had to write for the whole lot. Next thing we ended up doing was we had a strong commitment to marriage and relationships and so on, and we enrolled with the Anglican Marriage Guidance Council to become marriage educators. And we trained under a lass who, Betty Durand was her name, for 2 years roughly, on-the-job training, presenting seminars to engaged couples by way of preparing them for married life. We did that for probably, I don't know, 6 years, 4 or 5 years anyway. And then we went on to modifying what we learned there and using that and presenting marriage enrichment seminars for married couples, and that we did for quite a while. Then along the way, we, of course, in St. Matt's, and home groups were very much alive there. And I was in a home group that was led by June and Stuart Lawson. June was quite a gifted lady with a great voice and some musical ability, and she would play a guitar, and we would sing a few songs, and choruses as they were known back then. And then her husband, Stuart, would actually lead the Bible study. And after a few weeks, she says to me in her English voice, "Darling, you have a fairly decent voice. You must come and join us in the music group at church." And after a while, I thought, okay, fine, I'll do that. So I joined up and had my first outing with the band at St. Matt's. About that time, there was a series of conferences that were just kicking off, they were loosely called the Vineyard Pentecost Conferences. And prior to the conference, there was a prayer training and preparation day for all those that would be in ministry or service in any way, shape, or form to do with the presentation of that conference, which ran for the whole weekend of Pentecost weekend. And the music team at St. Matt's were going to do the present or lead the worship. And I was fine, part of the group, I could handle that. On the Friday night, June rings me up and she says, "Darling," she says, "I've come down with something. I can't be there tomorrow. You will have to lead." And at that point, I just about wet myself. I had had one occasion up front with the group in familiar circumstances, with people I knew and accepted and so on. And here it was, "You're going to ask me to do this up front, do the June bit with 150 people." So I thought, no, I can't handle that. So I contacted Tony Stevens, who was one of the organizers. I said, "Tony, you do the talkie and the prayer bit, and just flip to me and I'll lead the singing. I'm happy to do that, but I'm not where you need me to be." And so we did that, and that was my baptism into worship leading. Not long after that, I actually did become a worship leader at St. Matt's, and I guess I must have led worship for a good 8 or 10 years, every second Sunday. Somewhere around that point in time, St. Matt's had been running Life in the Spirit seminars, and these were a 6-week, 1 night a week course that taught about the Holy Spirit, what it was, how it functioned, the gifts of the Spirit, and this sort of stuff. And it was a building process. Adrian, as often as the case, was way in front of me, and was dead. I sensed she was dead set keen to do one of these things, but I was in no way ready. Things were happening at the church that I didn't understand, and I felt quite uncomfortable with, as the gifts of the Spirit were manifested and used and this sort of thing. And for those of you that know us, you know that patience is not Adrian's longest or strongest suit, except for this occasion. She had a strong sense that we should do this together when we did it. And she waited, and finally we attended the Life in the Spirit seminar together. And on that 6th evening, we made a commitment to basically give our lives to Christ and live with him as our head for the rest of our days. Next that came along was Alpha, and naturally we went to a course. We started leading courses, and I actually served as the Alpha Regional Advisor for the southeastern suburbs of Melbourne, and we went and did that for quite a while. During that time, I served on the leadership of St. Matt's in various roles over the years. After about 30 years there, we decided we needed to move to another church, and we went to the Mountain District Vineyard Church. It was a modest size at that point in time, and we were quite surprised by our welcome when, on the first day when we rocked up there. Many of you will remember Evan and Ewan Robertson. They have led worship here with me a few times over the last couple of years. They greeted us and welcomed us to the church. As often happens when I start singing in somewhere new, heads turn, and at the end of that first service they say, "Oh, you must come and join the choir and the music group and so on." I said, No. I says, "We don't know each other yet. We need to settle, and if after a while you think it's right and we feel it's right, then that will be time to engage and get into ministry. But this is too soon. We need time to settle and see if we're going to put down the roots and how those roots settle." That was a great church, very outwardly focused. We had pantry picks, which was like a grocery shopping for the needy. They'd have a list, tick off what they wanted that we packed and so on, have a community lunch, and off they went with the fruit and veg and all sorts of produce. We also had community nights, film nights and all that sort of thing. It was the most outwardly focused church I've ever worked in. And in fact, when we first looked at here at Heathmont, it struck me that here was a church that might not have been quite as far down the track as the Vineyard Church was, but it was certainly outward focused, and clearly it still is. After a while, I did join the music group there, and after some time, Shelley Taylor, who was the worship coordinator at MDVC, as it used to be known, she brought along a djembe, and I looked at that and thought, I ought to be able to play that, because I had played a skiffle bass in a rock and roll band as a teenager, and had great fun with that, and so on. So it was, I took up playing, and then the family gave me a djembe with a stand and the full kit, and I actually started doing that. And that was quite challenging, because it's one thing to get up and sing, it's another thing to get up and play. But when you have to do both and you're having to concentrate, I found it quite challenging. Anyway, comes the year of 2013, and my time's going, but anyway, that was a big year. I had sensed back about 2010 that I would be retiring at some point soon, and I thought it was time to sort of lay some groundwork and prep work for what I was going to do in retirement. So I filled out and put my profile in a web page known as Second Wind. It still, I think, operates under a different name. But I heard nothing for the longest while, and I was actually getting a bit narky with God, because I was praying about this over the time, and I was saying to God, look, you know my heart, you know what I'm going to be in service when I retire. How about you give me a clue as to what I'm going to be doing? How you want me to spend the rest of the days, sort of thing. Well, in 2013, it was a huge year. In the February, I clocked up 50 years of service with IBM, with a big celebration in Sydney. On the way back from that, I said to my boss, delicate situation, I didn't expect to be here now. I'm going to need some long service leave for an overseas trip. And he said, not a problem. So that was all done. And we went off on a 3-month trip to Europe. And when we came back, my job had changed by that time. And I thought, nah. I was twiddling my thumbs. I didn't have enough work. I could not take money for nothing. So I called my boss and said, it's time to talk retirement. And before we went away on the holiday in the March, I get an email from HCJB, which is a Christian shortwave radio station. It's now known as Reach Beyond. We've seen your profile in Second Wind, and we think you might fit in here. Would you come for an interview? Okay, fine. So I went and we interviewed each other, because I was not about to become an envelope fulfillment specialist every month, folding, sticking, stamping. If I was going to do something like that, it was going to have to be meaningful work. Anyway, we went off on holiday, came back, and in the October of 2013, I started and became a missionary. Yep. As a volunteer working with HCJB, Reach Beyond, doing all sorts of crazy things behind the scenes, cost cutting, workplace health and safety, all sorts of stuff. sadly, after quite a few years, we had to close the Vineyard Church, largely through illness of the leadership team. And at that point in time, we came here knowing we'd followed Mark from when he was a youth minister at St. Matt's to be an associate pastor in Wyndham Vale under Graham Laidlaw, and then he's moved to here as an associate pastor under Steve Rogero. And we'd sort of followed that, and we'd come to his inauguration, induction here, and we found the place friendly and so on. And so when we downsized from Wheelers Hill to Wantirna South, we started to come here, and we found it to be a very welcoming place. Alf reside and David Warren stick out as two people who really made us feel welcome in this church as we looked to would we put down fresh roots here. As time passed on, the need arose when Linda, who had been office manager and bookkeeper, was leaving the church, and I think Mark dobbed me in to say, here's somebody who had some skills, check him out for being the treasurer. And so Steve approached me and I became treasurer, and I'm still am. They haven't fired me yet, don't know why, but anyway. Then we come to the beginning of last year when Asher joins us, and Asher starts to put in roots in churches and not in schools, and we find ourselves signing up for the Kids Hope program, and for the last 18 months or 2 years, my three girls have been giving me a bit of pressure. Well, Dad, you know, you're always there fixing things and this, that, and the other. Who are you going to train up to fill this position when you're sort of not here anymore, sort of thing? And that got me thinking, and I've sort of settled on Sam. We have sessions of fix-its and so on, and he's certainly showing the interest and so on. But comes Asher, Kids Hope program, mentoring in schools, and I'm thinking, well, maybe this is something I can do. I mean, I've got a few miles under the clock and had one or two experiences along the way. I might be of some use in this area. And so we sign up and we fill in the form with all sorts of stuff about what you can and can't do and all that sort of stuff. And they hand that to the school, and the school do the matching to match up with an appropriate student who you will mentor. They paired me up with the fella called D, who was a year five student. And as we get to know each other and doing things and so on, I can see me in him at his age. He gets hold of some Lego and he just does, and he's made something. That's exactly how I was as a youngster. I was given a Meccano set. I'd thumb through the book and say, I like the picture of that, and I would just build it. No reading instructions, just build it. A few weeks before the end of term, some of the sessions we had were good. Some were like drawing teeth. It was just difficult to talk and so on. But there have been occasions when he sort of opened up to me about his family life and this sort of thing. Turns out his folks divorced some time ago. His dad is remarried, lives with stepmom and father. His natural mom noted for going off the rails. And I think there was even an intervention order against her at one point in time. And I'm thinking, the school didn't know about my past. This was, they knew about skills and that. When I was in basically my last year of primary school, my parents separated. And a couple of years later, when Dad was posted to England, Mum decided she wasn't going. And that was the end of that marriage. Mum never remarried, but there was a de facto in place who, Uncle Keith, who literally became my de facto father. And so here it was, I'm now with this guy, and we're matching in so many different ways. It was just uncanny. I should, at the end of each of the sessions, I fill in a form, what we did, what we said, that's major things and that sort of stuff. And then I'd hand that in to Janelle, who's the deputy principal there. Occasionally, if she's in the office, we might have an exchange of a few minutes of talk. Second to last week, I'm struggling to think, what am I going to do with this guy today? Last week was a disaster. The week before was great. And I'm going through stuff looking for a pen that I was given as part of an award. And I find this pen eventually, but I find a lot of other writing equipment that I've accumulated over the years, including a pencil given to me at De Carteret Primary School when the Queen was had a coronation. This was Queen Elizabeth II, not the first. And so I gather my pens together and we talk about pens and writing and so on, and I show you how we used to have the 3 lines, and the lowercase letters were the bottom 2, and the uppercase you get all 3, and that sort of thing. And at the end of that session, I'm sharing with Janelle what I've done, and she says to me, "This must be divine." I said, "What do you mean?" She says, "Well, earlier today, he struggled mightily in writing. He doesn't write very well, and he avoids it at all costs. And here it is, you come in, just planted this thing, and he liked my pen, the fountain pen. I don't think he'd ever seen one with real ink, And I said, well, sometimes I struggle. And I said, it's hard to know if I'm actually adding any value. Because if I'm not adding any value, I'm wasting my time. And she says, oh, yes, you are. He says, his teacher and I have noticed that in this term, he has become far less clingy, far more outgoing and confident. And there's only one reason for that. So God is still at work in me. I don't know what he has for me this year. I don't know. But here I am looking down the eyes of 83 this year, and I keep on keeping whatever God wants me to do for however long he wants me to do it. Thank you for bearing with me.